She thought signing a marriage contract with a cold, corporate stranger was her only escape from the monsters in her own bloodline. But as the ink dried, he locked the heavy oak door, slid a silver gun onto the mahogany desk, and whispered the one rule she wasn't allowed to break. If you were her, trapped between a family that wanted to sell you and a new husband who could destroy a city with a single nod, what would you have done? Jasmine Carter had spent her entire life surviving the cruel, calculated extortion of her own family. To them, she was nothing but collateral. Desperate for a way out, she bound herself to Jang Do-Hyuk, believing the sharply dressed, disciplined businessman would be her silent shield. But the moment she steps into his sprawling estate, the terrifying reality of her choice sets in. Do-Hyuk is a man composed of lethal restraint. His silence carries more weight than a scream, and his steady, unblinking gaze demands absolute control. He is no ordinary businessman, and this is no ordinary marriage. As Jasmine's family closes in, threatening to drag her back to the hell she escaped, a dangerous dynamic ignites inside the walls of her new home. She refuses to cower, and he refuses to let her go. What Jasmine doesn't yet know is that her safe haven is ruled by the most ruthless underworld boss in the city, and her fierce defiance is slowly awakening a dark, obsessive devotion that will either save her life or burn everything to the ground. The grandfather clock in the corner of the study ticked, the only sound in the cavernous, dimly lit room. Jasmine kept her eyes glued to the thick parchment resting on the mahogany desk. Article 4. Total compliance. The legal jargon blurred under the dim light, but she forced her hand to remain steady. Across from her, Jang Do-Hyuk hadn't moved a single muscle in 10 minutes. He sat in the high-backed leather chair, perfectly composed in a tailored charcoal suit, his dark, unblinking gaze resting heavily on her. The silence in the room wasn't just quiet, it was a physical weight, a calculated, suffocating pressure designed to make her crack. She picked up the heavy gold pen. Once the ink dries, there is no exit. Do-Hyuk's voice finally broke the stillness. It was a low, smooth baritone, entirely devoid of warmth. Understand exactly what you are trading. Jasmine snapped her head up. The impact of meeting his eyes felt like hitting a concrete wall. He wasn't looking at her with pity, nor was he impatient. He was dissecting her, watching the pulse in her throat, searching for the exact moment her nerve would shatter. A familiar, fiery defiance flared in her chest. She had spent a lifetime shrinking and folding to survive the monsters in her own bloodline. She absolutely refused to shrink now. "I'm trading one cage for another," she said, her voice remarkably steady despite the adrenaline flooding her veins. "But I know exactly what this one costs." Do-Hyuk didn't smile, but the subtle, almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw signaled a shift. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the desk, bringing the faint, sharp scent of cedar and cold rain with him. "Cost is irrelevant if you cannot pay it," he murmured. Jasmine didn't break eye contact as she pressed the nib to the paper. She slashed her signature across the dotted line, the sharp scratching sound echoing aggressively in the quiet room. Without a word, she slid the document across the polished wood. Do-Hyuk didn't look down at her name. His gaze remained locked on hers, dark and deeply unreadable. He slowly reached out, his long fingers brushing the edge of the paper, pulling it toward him. "Welcome home, Mrs. Jang," he said softly. The title felt less like a greeting and more like a warning. The air in the room shifted, thick and electric. Jasmine realized then that standing her ground hadn't just proven her strength, it had caught his full attention. And being noticed by a man like Do-Hyuk felt far more dangerous than being ignored. The iron gates of the estate closed behind them with a definitive, echoing clang. Jasmine stared through the tinted window of the sleek black sedan at the sprawling concrete and glass architecture looming in the darkness. It didn't look like a home, it looked like a fortress. Inside, the air was as sterile and frigid as the man walking silently ahead of her. The foyer was a cavern of polished black marble and sharp, minimalist lines. A line of staff stood perfectly straight along the wall, their eyes fixed firmly on the floor. No one spoke. No one breathed too loudly. The absolute submission of the people around him sent a chill down her spine, magnifying the terrifying scope of the power she had just bound herself to. Do-Hyuk stopped at the base of a sweeping, glass-paneled staircase. He didn't turn around immediately, forcing her to halt a few paces behind him. When he finally pivoted, his posture was a masterclass in controlled dominance. He slipped one hand into the pocket of his trousers, his dark eyes scanning her with an impassive, calculating weight. This estate operates on absolute order. His voice carried effortlessly through the cavernous space, low and unyielding. You will have access to the East Wing. The West Wing, the lower levels, and my private study are restricted. You will not ask questions about who comes and goes. You will not interfere with my staff. He took a slow, deliberate step toward her, closing the distance between them until she had to tilt her head up to maintain eye contact. The sheer physical presence of him was suffocating, a silent command designed to make her step back and yield her space. Jasmine planted her feet firmly on the cold marble. Her heart hammered against her ribs, the familiar urge to fold and survive screaming in her mind. But yielding meant giving him the autonomy her family had always stolen from her. She refused to be a ghost in her own survival plan. I understand the boundaries of the contract, she said, keeping her voice incredibly even, refusing to break his gaze. But if I am to live here as your wife, even in name only, I am not one of your soldiers. I will respect your walls, but I will not be treated like a prisoner inside them. The silence that followed was absolute. The staff seemed to collectively stop breathing. Do-Hyuk stared down at her, the dark, unreadable depths of his eyes narrowing by a fraction of an inch. For a suspended, agonizing second, the air cracked with the tension of two unbending wills colliding. He didn't raise his voice, nor did he display a shred of anger. Instead, a faint, almost imperceptible tilt of his head acknowledged the challenge. We will see, Mrs. Jang, he murmured, his tone laced with a dangerous, quiet intrigue, just how much space you can hold. The sprawling solitude of the East Wing was supposed to be a sanctuary, but as the burner phone in Jasmine's pocket violently vibrated against her hip, it felt like a trap. She stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the manicured, rain-slicked grounds of the estate, her breath hitching. Only 3 people knew this temporary number, and none of them were calling to check on her well-being. She pulled the small device out, the harsh glare of the screen illuminating the dread pooling in her stomach. A single text message glowed in the dim room. Did you really think a piece of paper would keep you from us? The debt is due, Jasmine. Come home by midnight, or we stop asking nicely. Her chest tightened, a phantom grip squeezing her lungs. It was her uncle, the man who had orchestrated her sale, the architect of her lifelong misery. He didn't care about the legalities of her new marriage. To him, she was an asset that had walked off the ledger. The immediate instinct to panic, to grab the small duffel bag she hadn't yet unpacked and run, clawed at her throat. But as she gripped the cold marble windowsill, the hard stone grounded her. She wasn't that terrified girl anymore. She had looked Jang Do-Hyuk in the eye and held her ground. She would not crumble at a text message. Her thumb hovered over the keypad. To involve Do-Hyuk would be to admit weakness, to prove she was the helpless liability he likely assumed her to be. Worse, bringing her family's filth to his doorstep could void the delicate protection she had just secured. He was a ruthless man of strict order. He would not tolerate her messy, bleeding past spilling onto his pristine floors. She had survived her family's extortion her entire life. She would handle this herself. Her fingers flew across the screen, her expression hardening into a mask of pure defiance. I belong to the Jang estate now, she typed, her pulse pounding a frantic rhythm in her ears. If you want me, you'll have to come through him. And we both know you don't have the courage for that. She hit send before she could lose her nerve, immediately powering down the phone and tossing it onto the silk-sheeted bed. It was a bluff, a desperate gamble using the terrifying shadow of her new husband as a shield. She had no idea if Do-Hyuk would actually step in to protect her, but her family didn't know that. Standing alone in the vast, quiet room, Jasmine wrapped her arms around herself, the chilling realization settling deep in her bones. She had just drawn a dangerous line in the sand, and when her family inevitably crossed it, she would be fighting a war on her own. The heavy rain had reduced the sprawling gardens of the estate to a wash of gray shadows. From the darkened vantage point of his second-story study, Jang Do-Hyuk stood perfectly still, a tumbler of amber liquid forgotten in his hand. His gaze was locked on the edge of the stone courtyard below. The perimeter alarms hadn't sounded. His men were intentionally letting the rat through. Do-Hyuk had ordered it. He needed to see exactly what his new wife would do when the ghost of her past finally cornered her. Jasmine stood on the wet cobblestone path, her coat pulled tight against the chill. The enforcer stepping out from the tree-line was a hulking brute from her uncle's syndicate, a man built entirely for intimidation. Even from a distance, Do-Hyuk could read the aggressive thrust of the man's posture as he closed the distance, his heavy hand reaching out to grab her arm and drag her back to the hell she had escaped. Do-Hyuk's thumb hovered over the silver intercom button on his desk. One press, and the enforcer would be dead before he took another breath. But Do-Hyuk hesitated, his dark eyes narrowing in quiet fascination. Jasmine didn't scream. She didn't shrink away. As the man's hand clamped down on her wrist, a visceral, feral energy seemed to snap through her. With a sudden, explosive pivot, she dropped her center of gravity, twisting her arm sharply against his thumb to break the hold. Before the enforcer could recover, she drove the heel of her boot brutally into his kneecap. The man let out a muffled roar of pain, staggering backward. He lunged again, fury twisting his features, but Jasmine was already moving. She snatched a heavy, iron-wrought lantern from its low garden hook, swinging it with a desperate, breathless ferocity. The heavy metal connected sickeningly with the side of the enforcer's jaw. He crumpled to the whetstones, groaning and clutching his face, temporarily neutralized by the sheer, unyielding violence of her refusal to be taken. Up in the shadows of the study, a profound, heavy silence settled over Do-Hyuk. He watched Jasmine stand over the fallen man, her chest heaving, rain plastering her hair to her cheeks. She was terrified. He could see the faint tremor in her shoulders, but she was unbroken. She possessed a terrifying, beautiful instinct to survive. He finally pressed the intercom button, his voice a low, lethal murmur. "Clean up the trash in the East Garden. Do not let her see you." As he released the button, Do-Hyuk didn't look away from the woman standing in the downpour. She was supposed to be a simple transaction, a fragile piece of collateral seeking a gilded cage. Instead, he realized with a dark, tightening pull in his chest, he had invited a fighter into his world. And for the first time in a very long time, the king of the Underworld was genuinely intrigued. The summons to the West Wing came just after midnight. Jasmine had been explicitly forbidden from crossing into Do-Hyuk's private territory, yet the stoic guard at her bedroom door simply stepped aside and gestured down the shadowy, dimly lit corridor. Her heart hammered a frantic, heavy rhythm against her ribs, but she kept her chin elevated, refusing to let her apprehension show. The heavy oak doors of the central study stood wide open. Inside, the air was thick with tension and the faint, acrid scent of cigar smoke. Do-Hyuk sat at the head of a long mahogany table, surrounded by half a dozen men. These were not corporate executives. They carried the lethal, coiled energy of predators, their tailored suits doing nothing to hide the unmistakable bulges of holstered weapons. On the table, a leather ledger lay open next to a silver combat knife, its blade stained with something dark and rust-colored. Silence crashed over the room the moment Jasmine crossed the threshold. 6 pairs of hardened, calculating eyes locked onto her. It was a physical weight, a collective intimidation designed to make an ordinary person turn and run. At the head of the table, Do-Hyuk leaned back in his leather chair, his long fingers loosely gripping a crystal tumbler. He didn't offer a word of introduction. He didn't offer her a sliver of protection. He simply watched her, his dark gaze entirely unreadable, waiting to see if she would shatter under the suffocating pressure of his true world. This was a calculated test. A heavily scarred man to Do-Hyuk's right smirked, leaning forward to drag the stained knife lazily across the polished wood. "The boss's new wife," he murmured, his voice dripping with condescension and veiled threat. "You look like you're in the wrong room, sweetheart. It gets messy in here." The urge to step backward burned in Jasmine's muscles. Every survival instinct she possessed screamed at her to flee this den of wolves. But fleeing meant she was fragile. Fleeing meant she belonged in a cage, and she had already promised herself she was done being prey. Forcing her breathing to slow, Jasmine stepped deeper into the room. Her heels clicked in a sharp, deliberate rhythm against the hardwood floor. She didn't look at the bloodied knife, nor did she look to Do-Hyuk for permission. She walked directly to the empty chair at her husband's immediate right, pulled it out, and sat down. She turned her gaze slowly to the scarred man, her expression a mask of absolute, icy composure. "If I were in the wrong room," she said, her voice smooth and devoid of a single tremor, "I wouldn't be sitting at the head of your table." The scarred man's smirk vanished, replaced by a rigid, deadly stillness. Beside her, Do-Hyuk took a slow sip of his drink. He didn't smile, but a dark, terrifying satisfaction flared in the depths of his eyes. She hadn't just survived the pressure cooker, she had claimed her space within it. And in the heavy silence of the room, the balance of power had just irrevocably shifted. The clock in the grand hallway chimed 3 times, the low reverberation swallowed by the suffocating silence of the estate. Jasmine sat awake in the shadowed expanse of her room, the events of the evening replaying endlessly in her mind. A heavy, uneven footstep outside her door suddenly broke the quiet. It wasn't the rhythmic, disciplined pacing of the night watch. It was a stagger. Driven by an instinct she couldn't name, she pulled the heavy oak door open. Jang Do-Hyuk stood leaning heavily against the cold marble wall of the corridor. His usually immaculate suit jacket was gone, and the crisp white fabric of his dress shirt was soaked through with a spreading, dark crimson stain along his left side. The metallic, heavy scent of fresh blood immediately flooded the space between them. He turned his head slowly. His jaw was locked tight, his skin unusually pale beneath the dim sconce lighting. For the first time since she had met him, his terrifying aura of absolute control was fractured. "Return to your room, Mrs. Jang," he ground out, his voice a gravelly, breathless command. Jasmine didn't move backward. The sight of his blood didn't trigger the panic she expected. Instead, it ignited a fierce, clinical focus. He was the most dangerous man she had ever met, a monster in his own right, but in this singular moment, he was bleeding out on her floor. Ignoring his directive, she stepped fully into the hallway, sliding her arm firmly under his uninjured side to brace his weight. "You are ruining the marble," she said softly, her voice betraying none of the adrenaline spiking in her veins. A harsh breath hitched in his chest, a sound caught halfway between a scoff and a groan, but he didn't push her away. He allowed her to guide him into her adjoining bathroom, sinking heavily onto the edge of the large porcelain tub. Jasmine moved with frantic precision, gathering towels and the heavy medical kit from beneath the sink. She knelt before him, her hands remarkably steady as she unbuttoned the ruined shirt, peeling the soaked fabric away from his skin. Beneath the blood, his torso was a canvas of old, jagged scars, a violent map of a life she knew nothing about. As she pressed a wad of sterile gauze hard against the deep laceration along his ribs, Do-Hyuk's entire body tensed. His hand shot out, his long fingers wrapping around her wrist like a vice. Jasmine froze, her breath catching in her throat as she slowly lifted her eyes to meet his. The cold, unyielding wall behind his gaze had shattered. What remained was raw, burning, and dangerously unguarded. He wasn't looking at her as a pawn or a test. He was looking at her as the only grounding force in a spinning room. The air between them thickened, heavy with the terrifying realization that beneath the armor of the ruthless syndicate boss was a man who had never had anyone tend to his wounds. And as his thumb brushed a slow, faint stroke against her pulse point, the absolute power of his restraint finally cracked. The sharp, violent crash of shattering glass echoed through the sterile corridors, piercing the estate's heavy silence. Jasmine froze, her pulse spiking as a terrified gasp followed the noise. She moved instinctively toward the sound, rounding the corner into the grand dining room. A young maid, barely out of her teens, was on her knees, her hands trembling violently as she tried to sweep up the jagged, amber-soaked remains of a crystal decanter. Looming over her was Kong, the hulking head of Do-Hyuk's security. In the syndicate, a careless mistake was viewed as a dangerous liability, and liabilities were dealt with brutally. Kong reached down, his massive fist gripping the girl's uniform collar to drag her to her feet. "You will not interfere with my staff." Do-Hyuk's cold, absolute directive from her first night rang loudly in Jasmine's mind. But the sight of the terrified girl violently yanked Jasmine back to her own past, the suffocating helplessness of being cornered, punished, and entirely alone. Before she could weigh the lethal consequences of breaking her husband's rule, she was already moving. "Let her go." Jasmine's voice cut through the room like a whip. Kong paused, his dark eyes narrowing with immediate disdain. "With respect, Mrs. Jang, this is not your concern. The boss's property was destroyed. She requires discipline." I said, "Take your hands off her." Jasmine stepped directly into the man's space, placing herself squarely between the weeping maid and the enforcer. She didn't flinch, even as Kang's imposing frame towered over her. The temperature in the room instantly plummeted. A shadow fell over the doorway. Do-Hyuk stepped into the dining room, his mere presence suffocating the air. His dark, unreadable gaze swept over the shattered crystal, the cowering girl, and finally settled on his wife, who was actively defying his authority in front of his men. "Explain," Do-Hyuk commanded, his voice a low, dangerous murmur that made the floorboards feel like ice. Kang immediately bowed his head. "The girl was careless, sir. I was correcting." "I knocked it over," Jasmine interrupted, her tone smooth and entirely steady. She lifted her chin, meeting Do-Hyuk's lethal stare head-on. "The girl was just cleaning up my mess. If there is a consequence for destroying your property, it falls on me." Silence stretched, thick and electric. Kang looked appalled by the blatant lie, but Do-Hyuk didn't break eye contact with Jasmine. He dissected her defiant expression, analyzing the fierce, protective fire burning in her eyes. She was risking his wrath, risking the fragile safety of her gilded cage for a stranger. It was reckless. It was complete insubordination. And yet, the cold fury he expected to feel never materialized. Instead, a dark, profound warmth took root in his chest. Do-Hyuk shifted his gaze to the guard. "Release her. And leave us." As Kong hastily retreated and the maid scurried away, Do-Hyuk stepped into Jasmine's space. He looked down at her, the rigid mask of his composure slipping just enough to reveal a dangerous, captivating gleam in his eyes. "You are a terrible liar, Mrs. Jang," he murmured softly, the words laced with a heavy, undeniable respect. The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days, casting a perpetual, suffocating gray over the city. Jasmine pulled her wool coat tighter, stepping out of the secluded, high-end apothecary Do-Hyuk had permitted her to visit. It was her first time outside the estate walls, a small, negotiated allowance of independence. But the moment the heavy glass door clicked shut behind her, the familiar, icy prickle of being hunted raised the hairs on the back of her neck. 2 figures detached themselves from the narrow, darkened alleyway beside her waiting town car. She recognized the crude, tattooed neck of her uncle's premier collector instantly. He stepped squarely into her path, blocking the passenger door, a heavy brass knuckle gleaming dully under the street lamp. "Your uncle is done playing games, Jasmine," the man sneered, his gaze dropping to grab her wrist. "The contract means nothing. You're coming home." Jasmine braced herself, her muscles coiling as she calculated the distance to the busy intersection. She opened her mouth to scream, but the sound never materialized. Before the collector's rough fingers could even graze the fabric of her coat, the very shadows of the street seemed to rip open. A man in a perfectly tailored dark suit materialized from the blind spot behind the town car. It was one of Do-Hyuk's silent sentinels, a guard she had only ever seen standing motionless in the estate's sprawling foyer. The sentinel didn't shout a warning. He didn't even draw a gun. He moved with a terrifying, fluid grace, slipping behind the collector in absolute silence. A black-gloved hand clamped viciously over the thug's mouth, cutting off his breath, while the other hand drove a short, dark blade with surgical precision directly beneath his ribs. The second attacker lunged, reaching for his waistband, but he was violently yanked backward into the pitch-black mouth of the alley by another unseen guard. A sickening, muffled crunch echoed briefly off the brick walls, followed by absolute silence. It was over in less than 5 seconds. The street was empty once more. The first sentinel smoothly wiped his blade on the falling thug's coat, letting the unconscious, bleeding body slump silently out of sight behind a steel dumpster. He didn't break a sweat, nor did his completely blank expression falter. He simply stepped into the glow of the street lamp, holstered his weapon, and reached out to open the heavy car door for Jasmine. "The boss prefers your path kept clear, Mrs. Jang," the guard murmured, bowing his head in profound respect. Jasmine stood frozen on the wet pavement, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. The chilling reality washed over her as she slid onto the pristine leather seat. Do-Hyuk wasn't just offering her shelter. He had silently unleashed the lethal might of his syndicate to shadow her every step. He was a weapon, and without a single word, he was already burning her enemies to the ground. The private dining room of the Golden Lotus was suffocatingly opulent, dripping in crystal chandeliers and gold leaf accents that did nothing to mask the venom at the table. Jasmine sat impeccably straight, her back barely grazing the velvet chair. She wore a backless, midnight blue silk gown that Do-Hyuk had silently delivered to her quarters, not as a gift, but as armor. Beside her, Do-Hyuk radiated a chilling, absolute calm. He sat with his hands resting lightly on the table, a glass of dark wine untouched before him. Across from them sat three men who controlled the southern shipping routes. They smiled with too many teeth, their eyes constantly darting to Jasmine, searching for the crack in the formidable boss's armor. To them, a new wife wasn't a partner, she was a liability. A bleeding target. "It is rare for Chairman Jang to bring a distraction to negotiations," the eldest of the men, Chairman Choi, purred. His gaze dragged over Jasmine with calculated disrespect. "We were beginning to worry the domestic life had softened his edge. Our business requires undivided attention, Mrs. Jang. It is no place for a delicate flower." The air in the room instantly turned to ice. Do-Hyuk didn't move, but the subtle, lethal shift in his posture promised violence. He didn't speak, letting the silence hang. This was the precipice, the moment they waited to see if she would cower and look to her husband for permission to speak, proving her fragility. Jasmine didn't look at Do-Hyuk. She calmly picked up her crystal wine glass by the stem, her fingers perfectly steady. She took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the silence stretch until Chairman Choi's condescending smile began to falter under her heavy gaze. "A flower," Jasmine finally echoed, setting the glass down with a soft, definitive clink. Her voice was smooth, cool, and carried effortlessly across the table. "I suppose that depends on the garden, Chairman Choi. Some roots are meant to be admired. Others are designed to choke out the weeds." She tilted her head, her dark eyes pinning the older man with a fierce, unblinking intensity. "If I were you, I would be far less concerned about my husband's edge and much more concerned about what happens to the weeds." Total silence slammed into the room. Choi's face flushed a deep, mottled red, the veiled threat landing with the precision of a sniper's bullet. He swallowed hard, shifting his gaze away from her and back to his untouched plate. Beside her, Do-Hyuk slowly leaned back in his leather chair. The corner of his mouth twitched a fraction of a millimeter, but in his world of absolute stoicism, it was a profound display of pride. He reached under the heavy tablecloth, his large, warm hand covering hers where it rested on her thigh. His thumb traced a slow, intensely possessive line against her skin. He had brought her to the wolves to see if she could survive the teeth, but instead, she had just shown them all who owned the pack. The envelope was perfectly blank, resting like a poison pill on the center of her mahogany vanity. Jasmine stared at it, the blood draining from her face. Do-Hyuk's estate was a fortress. The fact that her family had managed to slip something past his impenetrable security detail was a chilling message in itself. "We can still touch you." With trembling fingers, she broke the heavy wax seal. A single, glossy photograph slid out onto the polished wood, followed by a folded, heavily redacted police report dating back 6 years. The breath violently punched out of her lungs. It was an image of a damp alleyway, illuminated by the harsh flash of a camera. In the center of the frame lay a man, blood pooling darkly beneath his head, his lifeless eyes staring vacantly into the lens. It was the man her uncle had sent to break her in when she first tried to run away. She had fought back, her desperate survival instinct taking over until she was standing over his motionless body with a bloodied iron pipe. Her uncle had made the body disappear. He had played the savior, cleaning up the mess and burying the evidence, only to keep it locked in a vault as the ultimate leash. The burner phone hidden in her drawer vibrated, a harsh, buzzing sound that shattered the room's suffocating silence. She didn't have to look at the screen to know who it was. She answered, bringing the device to her ear with a shaking hand. "He demands absolute order, Jasmine." Her uncle's voice slithered through the speaker, dripping with venomous triumph. Chairman Jang built his empire on loyalty and zero liabilities. What do you think the merciless head of the Korean Mafia will do when he realizes his new bride brought a covered-up murder and a buried police investigation right to his pristine doorstep? Jasmine gripped the edge of the vanity, her knuckles turning white. The cold, sickening reality of her uncle's extortion sank its claws into her chest. Do-Hyuk's syndicate was untouchable because he left no loose ends. This secret didn't just paint her as a killer, it painted her as a catastrophic, uncontrollable risk to his entire empire. Midnight, her uncle continued, the smugness thickening. "Walk out the front gates and get into the car waiting at the bottom of the hill. If you don't, I send the original file to Do-Hyuk's lieutenants. Let's see how long his protection lasts when his own men demand your execution." The line went dead. Jasmine dropped the phone, staring blankly at the damning photograph. She had fought so hard to reclaim her agency, to stand tall in a world of wolves, and slowly, she had begun to carve out her own unshakable space beside a terrifyingly powerful man. But as the shadows lengthened across her bedroom, the suffocating walls of her past closed in once more. Her family wasn't just threatening her life anymore. They were threatening to destroy the only true sanctuary she had ever found. The grandfather clock chimed 1:15. Jasmine stood in the center of her shadowed room, her winter coat buttoned to her throat. She carried no bags. Taking anything from the estate would feel like theft. She was leaving to protect the only sanctuary she had ever known, sacrificing her freedom so her uncle's poisonous secret wouldn't infect Do-Hyuk's untouchable empire. She slipped into the silent, cavernous hallway, her heart a hollow drum in her chest. But as she reached the top of the grand staircase, a sharp, metallic clink froze the blood in her veins. A small flame flared in the pitch-black foyer below. Jang Do-Hyuk stood at the base of the stairs, bathed in the faint, flickering orange light of a silver lighter. In his other hand, he held a thick, yellowed manila folder. The original police file. "Going somewhere, Mrs. Jang?" His voice drifted up the sweeping staircase. It wasn't his usual cold, disciplined murmur. It was a low, terrifying growl, vibrating with a dark, coiled violence. Jasmine's breath caught. "You don't understand," she whispered, descending the steps with trembling legs. "If that gets out, the lieutenants will turn on you. I am a liability to your syndicate. I have to go." Do-Hyuk didn't move as she reached the bottom step. He simply stared down at her, the rigid mask of his emotional restraint entirely shattered. What burned in his dark eyes wasn't anger at her deception. It was a ruthless, obsessive fury directed at the world that had dared to threaten what was his. "A liability," he repeated softly, the word dripping with lethal disdain. He tossed the folder onto the polished black marble between them. He brought the lighter down, and in an instant, the only evidence of her darkest secret went up in a sudden, brilliant blaze. Jasmine stared at the ashes curling into the air, completely stunned. Do-Hyuk closed the distance between them in 2 massive strides, his absolute presence swallowing the space. He didn't stop until she was backed against the chilled marble of the banister. He raised his hands, planting them firmly on the stone on either side of her head, caging her in. "The leverage is ashes," he murmured, leaning down until his lips were a breath away from her ear. "The men who breached my security to deliver that photograph are already dead. And the uncle who thought he could use your survival against me is currently learning the true cost of extortion." He pulled back just enough to force her to meet his unwavering, fierce gaze. The terrifying scope of his devotion crashed over her. He hadn't just protected his empire, he had burned down her nightmare. "You do not run," Do-Hyuk commanded, his voice a heavy, velvet promise that cemented the monumental shift between them. "You do not bleed for them anymore. You stay exactly where you belong." The scent of ash and burnt paper lingered heavily in the grand foyer, a sharp, bitter tang that coated the back of Jasmine's throat. She stood frozen against the cold marble banister, her eyes tracing the faint gray smudges left on the floor where her darkest secret had been reduced to nothing. Do-Hyuk had stepped back, giving her space to breathe, but his presence remained an undeniable, suffocating force in the dimly lit hall. He watched her with a steady, unblinking intensity, waiting for the inevitable fracture. He had just confessed to murder. He had openly admitted to unleashing unspeakable violence upon her own bloodline. By all societal metrics, she should be terrified. She should be clawing at the heavy oak doors, desperate to escape the monster who casually orchestrated death before midnight. But as Jasmine's trembling fingers gripped the icy stone rail, the panic never came. Instead, a terrifying, profound clarity washed over her. For her entire life, she had played by the rules of morality. She had endured the extortion and the suffocating cage of her family's cruelty, waiting for the righteous deliverance that the world promised to victims. It had never arrived. The law hadn't protected her. Righteousness hadn't shielded her. Jang Do-Hyuk had. She lifted her gaze, studying the sharp, shadowed planes of his face. He was a king of the underworld, a man whose hands were stained with more blood than she could fathom, yet those same hands were the only ones that had ever built a fortress around her. He hadn't judged the blood on her ledger. He had simply set it on fire so it could never be used to chain her again. The sheer, terrifying magnitude of his power wasn't a threat anymore. It was her absolute shield. "You killed them," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the ticking of the grandfather clock. It wasn't an accusation. It was an acknowledgement. Do-Hyuk's jaw tightened. "I eliminated a threat to my estate. To my wife." His voice was a low, uncompromising rumble. "Do you fear me now, Jasmine?" She slowly pushed away from the banister, stepping out of the shadows and directly into his space. The dark, lethal energy radiating from him would have sent hardened men to their knees, but Jasmine merely reached out. Her hand trembled as she pressed her palm flat against the center of his chest. She could feel the steady, powerful rhythm of his heart beneath his crisp shirt. "I fear what I would have become without you," she answered, the absolute truth of the words anchoring them both. Do-Hyuk's breath hitched, the slightest fracture in his iron composure. He covered her hand with his own, his grip possessive and fierce, as the scales of her world permanently tipped. She was no longer a captive in a cold estate. She had made a pact with the devil, and for the first time in her life, she felt entirely safe. The air in the subterranean warehouse was thick with the stench of stagnant water and cheap tobacco, a sharp contrast to the pristine marble of the Jang estate. Marcus Carter, Jasmine's uncle, wiped a bead of cold sweat from his brow. His corrupt empire was rapidly crumbling. Over the past 48 hours, Do-Hyuk's invisible, calculated strikes had systematically decimated his supply lines, frozen his offshore accounts, and silenced his most ruthless enforcers. Desperation had finally driven Marcus into the darkest, most volatile corner of the city. Across a rusted metal table sat Bae Sung-jin, the erratic, bloodthirsty head of the Red Dragon Syndicate. Sung-jin smiled lazily, leaning back in the shadows. He didn't care about Marcus's failing debts or his pathetic family drama. He only cared about the undisputed crown that Jang Do-Hyuk wore so effortlessly. "You come to me with nothing but ashes, Carter," Sung-jin rasped, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "Jang has gutted your operation. Why should I bleed my own men to retrieve a runaway niece?" "Because she is his only blind spot," Marcus hissed, slamming his fist onto the table, his voice trembling with venomous hatred. "Jang Do-Hyuk has never taken a wife. He has never let a single soul inside his walls, yet he is burning the city to the ground to protect her. She is the only leverage that can make the untouchable king bow." Sung-jin's reptilian eyes narrowed. A chilling, heavy silence stretched through the damp warehouse. The prospect of humiliating the most powerful boss in the Korean underworld, of dragging Do-Hyuk's prized possession out of his gilded fortress and forcing his surrender, was an intoxicating currency. "I don't want your money," Sung-jin finally murmured, flicking his fingers to signal the dozens of heavily armed mercenaries waiting in the periphery. "When we take her, the girl belongs to me to use as bait. And when Jang falls in the crossfire, I take his entire territory." Marcus swallowed hard, essentially signing away his own life, and nodded. The blood pact was struck. Miles away, within the impenetrable walls of her sanctuary, Jasmine stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of Do-Hyuk's private study. She watched the bruised, heavy storm clouds gathering over the city skyline, an inexplicable, icy dread settling deep in her bones. The estate had been perfectly quiet, too quiet. Behind her, Do-Hyuk sat perfectly still at his mahogany desk. He hadn't looked at his phone or spoken to his guards, but the air around him had grown terrifyingly dense. His predatory instincts were already humming, sensing the violent shift in the city's undercurrents. He looked up, his dark eyes locking onto Jasmine's silhouette against the glass. The wolves were no longer just circling in the dark. They were joining packs, and they were preparing to breach his gates. The heavy steel doors of the Red Dragon Syndicate's underground compound violently imploded, the deafening blast vibrating through the damp concrete floor. Smoke and ash choked the air, but the men inside didn't even have time to raise their weapons. Jang Do-Hyuk walked through the settling dust like a god of war stepping into the abyss. He had shed his immaculate suit jacket, his crisp white shirt rolled up to the forearms, revealing the dark, sprawling ink of his syndicate tattoos. The terrifyingly calm, restrained businessman that Jasmine had married was entirely gone. In his place was the apex predator of the Korean underworld, unchained and consumed by a singular, obsessive purpose, annihilating anyone who dared to threaten his wife. Behind him, dozens of his elite sentinels flooded the warehouse. It wasn't a battle, it was an execution. Do-Hyuk's strike was surgical, silent, and absolute. He moved through the chaos with a lethal grace, his dark eyes fixed entirely on the rusted staircase leading to the overseer's office. He didn't flinch as gunfire echoed around him. He simply raised his own weapon, his precision ruthless and unwavering, clearing his path with terrifying efficiency. Bae Song-jin barely made it halfway to the emergency exit before Do-Hyuk's heavy boot slammed into the center of his chest, sending the rival boss crashing backward across his own desk. The erratic, bloodthirsty man who had conspired with Jasmine's uncle suddenly looked profoundly small under the crushing weight of Do-Hyuk's shadow. Do-Hyuk leaned over the desk, the cold barrel of his gun pressing flush against Song-jin's forehead. His chest heaved slightly, the only physical sign of the violence he had just orchestrated. "You conspired with a dead man," Do-Hyuk murmured, his voice a gravelly, demonic whisper that chilled the room to absolute zero. "And you dared to put a bounty on the queen of my estate." Song-jin choked on a breath, his bravado entirely shattered. "Jang, wait." "There is no waiting," Do-Hyuk interrupted softly, his dark eyes completely devoid of mercy. "You looked at what was mine. Now your empire is ashes." The gunshot was definitive, echoing with brutal finality. An hour later, the iron gates of the estate opened. Jasmine stood in the center of the grand foyer, her heart in her throat as the heavy front doors parted. Do-Hyuk stepped into the light. His clothes were stained with ash and the blood of her enemies, his knuckles bruised, his chest rising and falling heavily. He looked terrifying. He looked like a monster. But as his dark, exhausted eyes locked onto hers, the violent storm within him instantly broke. He crossed the marble floor, dropping his weapon onto a side table, and pulled her forcefully into his chest. Jasmine buried her face in his neck, wrapping her arms tightly around his broad shoulders. He had burned the world down so she could sleep in peace, cementing a dark, unbreakable devotion that neither of them could ever undo. The morning after the bloodbath, the atmosphere in the estate shifted from a quiet sanctuary to a suffocating vault. Jasmine found the heavy oak doors of the East Wing Library, her usual morning retreat, firmly locked. At the end of the corridor, two towering sentinels stood motionless, their dark suits a stark contrast to the pristine marble walls. When she stepped toward the grand staircase, one of them moved, smoothly but immovably blocking her path. "Chairman's orders, Mrs. Jang. You are to remain in the primary suite until further notice." A cold spark of fury ignited in her chest. She had not survived the ruthless extortion of her own bloodline just to be swaddled in velvet and locked in a tower by her husband. She didn't argue with the guards. She turned on her heel and marched directly toward Do-Hyuk's private study in the restricted West Wing, pushing the heavy double doors open without knocking. Do-Hyuk stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the rain-lashed grounds. He didn't turn as she entered, though the slight tightening of his broad shoulders betrayed his awareness. The air in the room was dense, heavy with the lingering adrenaline of the previous night's violence and a new, terrifying paranoia that had taken root in the Underworld king. "Am I a prisoner again, Do-Hyuk?" Her voice was remarkably steady, though it vibrated with absolute defiance. He finally turned. The dark shadows beneath his eyes spoke of a sleepless night, his stoic mask fractured by the raw, obsessive need to keep her breathing. "The city is unstable," he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly command that left no room for debate. "Seong-jin's remnants are scattering. Your uncle is desperate. You are safe in the primary quarters. You will stay there." Jasmine closed the distance between them, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor until she was standing inches from his chest. She had to tilt her head to meet his intense, unblinking gaze, but she utterly refused to step back. "You burned down a syndicate for me," she said, her tone fearless, her dark eyes pinning him in place. "You showed the entire underworld that I am yours. And now you want to hide me away like a fragile piece of collateral? Like I am a weakness to be exploited." Do-Hyuk's jaw clenched. His hand came up, his large, warm fingers gripping her waist with a desperate, possessive strength. "You are my only vulnerability, Jasmine," he breathed, the admission tearing through his iron restraint. "I will not let them touch you." "Then do not put me in a cage," she fired back, covering his hand with her own. "I didn't marry a warden, and I refuse to be a pawn waiting in the dark. If I am the queen of this estate, you will let me stand beside you. As your equal." The silence that followed was deafening. Do-Hyuk stared down at her, the suffocating grip of his fear violently colliding with the awe-inspiring reality of her unbreakable strength. The storm outside lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the study, casting fractured shadows across Jang Do-Hyuk's face. He stared down at Jasmine, his breathing shallow, his grip on her waist tight enough to bruise. For a man who had spent his entire life mastering absolute control, the concept of yielding was entirely foreign. It was a vulnerability that got men killed in his world. "An equal," Do-Hyuk repeated, the words tasting like ash and iron on his tongue. He searched her dark, unyielding eyes, looking for a trace of the fear that should have driven her to hide in the safety of his bedroom. He found nothing but a fierce, brilliant inferno. "I am not a porcelain doll to be locked in a vault while you burn the city," Jasmine said, her voice dropping to a smooth, unwavering murmur. She didn't pull away from his bruising grip. Instead, she stepped closer, effectively erasing the final sliver of space between them. "If my family is coming for me, I will face them. But I will do it standing beside the monster they are terrified of, not hiding behind him." The raw, unfiltered truth of her words struck Do-Hyuk with the force of a physical blow. He had built his empire on isolation, trusting no one, carrying the weight of the underworld entirely on his own shoulders. He had viewed her as a beautiful vulnerability he needed to bury in the dark to keep safe. But as he looked at the woman who had defied him, who had patched his wounds and stared down his lieutenants without a flinch, the terrifying realization finally settled into his bones. She wasn't his weakness. She was his equal. Do-Hyuk's jaw clenched. Slowly, the frantic, possessive tension bled from his broad shoulders. His grip on her waist loosened, shifting from a desperate hold into a dark, reverent caress. He slid his hand up her spine, his long fingers tangling softly in her hair, tilting her head back to hold her gaze. "If you stand beside me, there is no turning back," he whispered, the cold, disciplined mask of the chairman permanently shattering to reveal the obsessive, devoted man beneath. "You will see the darkest parts of my soul, Jasmine. You will be steeped in the blood of the syndicate, and you will never be able to leave." "I stopped running the day I signed your contract," she answered, completely resolute. Do-Hyuk closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, a heavy, shuddering breath escaping his chest. When he opened them, the king of the underworld bowed his head, resting his forehead against hers. It was an act of profound submission, a silent vow that the cage was broken. He reached into his coat pocket, withdrawing a heavy black master keycard, and pressed it into her palm. It wasn't just the access to the estate's restricted wings, it was the key to his entire empire. The dynamic had irrevocably shifted. They were no longer captor and collateral, they were sovereigns of the dark. The forged message arrived on a secure channel only Do-Hyuk's top lieutenants were supposed to access. It detailed a massive breach at the southern docks, claiming the chairman had been isolated and pinned down by the remnants of the Red Dragon Syndicate. Jasmine knew the catastrophic risks of stepping outside the estate's iron gates, but the terrifying prospect of Do-Hyuk bleeding out in the rain entirely eclipsed her logic. She was no longer a protected pawn, she was his equal, and she would not let him fall alone. She drove the sleek, armored SUV herself, navigating the winding, desolate cliffside roads to the abandoned shipyard. The violent storm from the previous night had left the air thick with fog and the sharp, bitter scent of brine. As she cut the engine and stepped out into the damp, echoing silence of the docks, the shadows immediately shifted. The heavy metallic screech of a shipping container violently sliding shut echoed behind her, cutting off her only exit. Industrial floodlights snapped on all at once, blindingly bright, pinning her like a target in the center of the wet concrete. From the blinding glare, Marcus Carter emerged. Her uncle's usually immaculate suit was ruined, his face bruised and twisted with a desperate, feral madness. Behind him stood a dozen heavily armed mercenaries. This wasn't a rescue mission. It was a slaughter disguised as bait. "He isn't here, Jasmine," Marcus sneered, his voice vibrating with a venomous mix of triumph and sheer panic. "Your untouchable husband isn't bleeding on the docks. But he will be soon enough, once he realizes his precious queen walked right back into my cage." The icy shock of the deception washed over her, but the suffocating panic that had ruled her entire childhood never materialized. Jasmine stood perfectly still under the harsh lights. She didn't shrink under her uncle's crazed gaze, nor did she drop her eyes. The trembling, desperate girl who had signed her life away in a dark study was dead. In her place stood the matriarch of the city's most lethal syndicate. "You think you set a trap," Jasmine said, her voice carrying an eerie, absolute calm that perfectly mirrored Do-Hyuk's chilling restraint. She slowly reached into the pocket of her coat, her fingers wrapping around the cold steel of the heavy pistol Do-Hyuk had pressed into her hands just hours ago. "But all you did was dig your own grave." Marcus sparked a harsh, manic laugh, raising his weapon. "You're delusional. You're entirely alone, Jasmine. It ends here." Jasmine didn't flinch as the mercenaries raised their rifles, the red laser sights painting her chest. She simply tilted her chin up, a dark, terrifying smile curving her lips. "I am never alone," she whispered. Before Marcus could pull the trigger, the low, synchronized hum of heavy, armored engines violently vibrated through the foundation of the docks. The shadows surrounding the shipyard didn't just shift, they armed themselves. The deafening roar of a dozen matte black SUVs tearing through the corrugated metal fencing violently drowned out the storm. They encircled the shipyard in a flawless, inescapable perimeter, their blinding high beams slicing through the dense fog to pin Marcus Carter and his mercenaries in a glaring ring of light. The trap hadn't been sprung on Jasmine. Marcus had merely locked himself inside a cage with the most lethal force in the country. Before the vehicles even skidded to a complete halt, the doors flew open. Over 50 heavily armed sentinels poured out, their weapons raised in terrifying, disciplined unison. The red laser sights that had been aimed at Jasmine's chest a second ago were instantly replaced by dozens of dots painting Marcus and his men. The mercenaries, realizing the catastrophic mistake they had made, dropped their rifles to the wet concrete without firing a single shot. From the lead SUV, Jang Do-Hyuk emerged. He moved through the rain-slicked shipyard like a force of nature, his long, dark coat billowing around him. The cold, unyielding businessman was completely gone. The man walking toward them was the undisputed king of the underworld, radiating a violent, suffocating aura of absolute authority. His dark eyes didn't even register the trembling mercenaries parting frantically to make way for him. His gaze was locked entirely on Jasmine. Marcus stumbled backward, the blood draining from his face as his knees hit the unforgiving pavement. "Jang," he stammered, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched wheeze. "She came to me. I didn't." Do-Hyuk didn't slow his stride. As he passed Marcus, his boot lashed out with bone-crushing force, burying into the older man's ribs and sending him sprawling into a puddle of grimy rainwater. Do-Hyuk didn't even look down at the groveling figure. He walked straight to Jasmine. When he reached her, the terrifying, lethal tension rolling off his broad shoulders violently collided with a desperate, overwhelming devotion. He reached out, his large hands framing her face, his thumbs sweeping over her cheekbones as if checking to ensure she was real, unharmed, and unbroken. "Are you hurt?" His voice was a raw, gravelly whisper meant only for her, entirely stripping away the terrifying monster he presented to the rest of the world. "I'm untouched," Jasmine murmured, leaning into the warmth of his palm, her own unbreakable strength grounding his fraying control. Do-Hyuk exhaled a jagged breath, closing his eyes for a fraction of a second. When he opened them, he turned his head slowly, his icy, merciless gaze falling on the pathetic, kneeling figure of her uncle. He pulled Jasmine flush against his side, his arm wrapping around her waist in a deeply possessive hold that broadcasted a single, undeniable truth to every soul in the shipyard. "Look closely at the woman you tried to break," Do-Hyuk commanded, his voice echoing over the docks like a death knell. "You are not looking at collateral. You are kneeling before the queen of my syndicate." The rain continued to batter the concrete of the shipyard, washing the grime into the harbor, but Marcus Carter's violent shivering had nothing to do with the cold. He knelt in the muddy puddles, staring up at the monolithic force of Jang Do-Hyuk and the niece he had tried to break. He waited for the flash of a muzzle, anticipating the quick, violent end to his miserable gamble. But Do-Hyuk didn't draw his weapon. Death was far too merciful a punishment for the man who had tormented his queen. "A bullet is a privilege you have not earned," Do-Hyuk's voice cut through the howling wind, smooth, lethal, and completely devoid of warmth. He gave a single, subtle nod to his lieutenants. Over the next 48 hours, the execution of the Carter family was not carried out with knives or guns, but with absolute, terrifying financial and social annihilation. From the shadowed confines of his private study, Do-Hyuk dismantled their lives piece by agonizing piece. Jasmine stood by his side, her hand resting on his shoulder as she watched the syndicate's operatives systematically drain every offshore account, shell company, and hidden vault her family possessed. Their generational wealth evaporated into the digital ether in mere seconds, funneled away and erased from existence. Next came their power. The corrupt politicians, judges, and law enforcement officials on Marcus's payroll received a single, anonymous dossier from the Jang Syndicate. It contained undeniable proof of their illicit dealings and a polite, chilling suggestion to sever all ties. Overnight, the Carter name became a toxic contagion. Allies vanished into the shadows. Loyal enforcers fled the city. The family was entirely isolated, stripped of the terrifying influence they had wielded over Jasmine for her entire life. The final blow was their freedom. Marcus had threatened to cage Jasmine with a buried police report, so Do-Hyuk returned the favor with devastating irony. He didn't kill her uncle. He handed him over to the federal authorities, neatly packaged with a mountain of irrefutable, unredacted evidence detailing decades of extortion, trafficking, and murder. There would be no bail. There would be no high-priced lawyers, as their funds no longer existed. Marcus Carter and his accomplices were dragged from their foreclosed mansions in handcuffs, screaming, destitute, and utterly broken. They were locked away in maximum security cells where Do-Hyuk's vast, invisible reach guaranteed they would suffer every agonizing day of their life sentences. Standing in the grand foyer of the estate, Jasmine watched the muted news broadcast of her uncle's arrest. The suffocating weight she had carried since childhood finally dissolved into the quiet air of her sanctuary. She had survived their cruelty on her own, but Do-Hyuk had entirely erased their existence. He had taken the monsters from her past and reduced them to less than ash, proving that his wrath was just as absolute as his devotion. The heavy oak doors of the West Wing study were closed, shutting out the rest of the sprawling estate. On the massive mahogany desk, Jang Do-Hyuk had laid out the entirety of his life. Leather-bound ledgers, encrypted drives, and the deeds to a shadow empire spanning continents rested between them. The violence of the past week had finally settled, leaving behind a heavy, profound stillness in the room. Do-Hyuk stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, the morning light casting long shadows across the sharp planes of his face. He looked at Jasmine, the rigid, impenetrable armor he wore for the world completely stripped away. In his dark eyes burned a raw vulnerability he had never shown another living soul. "This is the reality of my existence," Do-Hyuk murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. He gestured to the desk. "It is built on blood, coercion, and absolute ruthlessness. There is no light in these pages, Jasmine. I am the monster your family warned you about." He reached into his tailored jacket and withdrew a single, pristine white envelope, sliding it across the polished wood toward her. "Untraceable accounts. A new identity. Total, unconditional freedom," he said, the words clearly tearing at his chest, though his posture remained flawlessly controlled. "You have survived the extortion. Your family is destroyed. You no longer need a shield. If you walk out those gates today, you will never have to look over your shoulder again." Jasmine stared at the envelope. Months ago, she would have surrendered her soul for it. It was the exact escape she had prayed for when she first signed his oppressive marriage contract. But as she looked up from the stark white paper to the man standing before her, the man who had waged war against the entire underworld just to ensure she could breathe, she realized the thought of leaving felt like tearing out her own heart. She didn't reach for the envelope. Instead, she stepped forward, her heels clicking definitively against the hardwood floor. She picked up a heavy silver lighter resting near his crystal tumbler, ignited the flame, and held it directly to the corner of the envelope. Do-Hyuk's breath hitched, a silent tremor rocking his broad shoulders as the paper blackened and curled into ash, dropping harmlessly into an empty tray. "I told you I stopped running," Jasmine said smoothly, closing the distance between them until she was close enough to feel the heat radiating from his chest. She reached up, her hands sliding over the lapels of his suit to rest firmly against his shoulders. "I don't want a new identity, Do-Hyuk. And I don't want a world where you are not standing beside me." With a fierce, possessive groan, Do-Hyuk crushed her against him, his lips capturing hers in a bruising, desperate kiss that sealed their dark pact. She wasn't just his wife anymore. She had willingly chosen his shadows, claiming her absolute power and rising to become the undisputed queen of his empire. The rain that once felt like a cage against the heavy glass of the estate now mirrored a quiet, cleansing peace. Jasmine stood on the sprawling balcony of the West Wing, the city lights glittering like scattered diamonds in the valley below. She traced the cold iron of the railing, her mind drifting to the trembling, desperate woman who had first walked through these gates. She had arrived seeking merely to survive, carrying the heavy, suffocating weight of a lifetime spent as a pawn. But survival, she realized, was only the baseline of resilience. True strength wasn't forged in the absence of fear, but in the agonizing, unyielding refusal to break when the world demanded her submission. Every threat, every calculated extortion from her bloodline had been the fire that tempered her resolve. She hadn't just endured the darkness, she had learned to harness it. A familiar, heavy warmth settled over her shoulders as Do-Hyuk draped his suit jacket around her against the evening chill. He didn't say a word, stepping to her side and resting his large, scarred hand over hers on the railing. His presence, once a terrifying manifestation of absolute control, was now the anchor of her entire existence. The world saw him only as a monster, a ruthless syndicate boss who ruled the shadows with iron and blood. But as Jasmine leaned back against his solid chest, feeling the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart, she understood the profound paradox of their bond. It was within this terrifying, unforgiving world that she had found the purest devotion. Do-Hyuk hadn't demanded her obedience or stripped her of her agency to keep her safe. Instead, he had systematically burned down the cages that held her, giving her the space and the absolute power to rise as his equal. He had shown her that redemption wasn't always a righteous, pristine path paved with light. Sometimes redemption was found in the fierce, uncompromising loyalty of a man who was willing to damn his own soul to protect hers. His dark devotion had not consumed her, it had liberated her. "The city is quiet tonight," Do-Hyuk murmured, his low voice vibrating against her spine. He pressed a soft, lingering kiss to the crown of her head, a rare, unguarded gesture of reverence from a king to his queen. It knows exactly who is watching, Jasmine replied, her voice smooth and unwavering. She turned her hand over, intertwining her fingers with his. They stood together in the shadows, two souls scarred by the cruelty of the world, yet entirely unbroken. Jasmine had walked into the devil's lair seeking a temporary escape, but through the crucible of their shared hardship, she had forged an empire. She had reclaimed her agency not by running from the darkness, but by ruling it, proving that the most unbreakable power is born when resilience meets absolute, unyielding loyalty.